It's a question you hear all the time. Why celibacy for Catholic priests is a huge point of discussion, right? Well, today we're going to jump right into the source material itself and unpack the theological logic, the why behind this long-standing tradition. Okay, so let's tackle the elephant in the room right away, the big objection, right? You've got a tradition that praises celibacy, and, well, it was written almost entirely by celibates. So isn't that just a classic case of self-justification? It seems like a massive conflict of interest. So how does the tradition itself actually push back against that idea? All right, first up, the apostolic defense. How does the tradition answer the charge of bias? Well, its first line of defense is to go way back. I mean, right back to the beginning. The whole argument is grounded in the words of two really, really big figures in the early church. You got the Apostle Paul, and then a few hundred years later, the scholar St. Jerome. So the thinking goes like this. St. Paul's celibacy wasn't a bias. It was actually his qualification. He wasn't just some guy theorizing from an armchair. He was living this life. He even wrote that he wished everyone could be like him, totally free to focus on God with what he called undivided interests. And he threw in this real sense of urgency, saying the time is shortened. The idea being, hey, the end could be near, so earthly stuff is just a distraction. So from this perspective, his personal experience is exactly what makes him a credible source, not a biased one. But this idea definitely didn't just sail through without any pushback. Oh, no. Back in the 4th century, there was this monk, Jovinian, and he basically said, hold on a minute. He argued that all states of life, whether you're married, widowed, or a virgin, are spiritually equal. He famously said, a virgin is no better than a wife. And bam, that was a huge, direct challenge. It really forced the church to get specific and define its position way more clearly. And the response from St. Jerome? Whoa, it was fiery. He didn't just disagree with Jovinian, he completely reframed the whole debate and set up a very clear hierarchy. He said, sure, marriage is a good thing, but he framed it as a kind of concession, something we need because of our fallen, post-Eden reality. Virginity, though, he called that a heavenly consecration. It was seen as a way to get back to that original purity of Eden. So the takeaway was crystal clear. Marriage is good, but virginity, that's presented as being objectively better. Okay, so this brings us to section 2, an argument from Revelation. And this is really the central pillar of the entire argument. We're moving beyond just personal opinions now and getting into the very rules of theological debate. This is the part that explains the why the tradition is so confident in its own position. Now, the source material is really clear on this. It argues that we're not talking about a weak argument from authority, like when a celebrity tries to sell you a car. No. This is an argument from a very specific, very powerful type of authority, divine revelation. And within this whole framework, truths that are believed to be revealed in Scripture, well, they're considered the absolute highest, most certain form of proof you can possibly have. And this whole distinction was laid out perfectly by the titan of theology himself, St. Thomas Aquinas. For Aquinas, it was simple. When you're debating theology, an argument that relies only on human reason, that's the weakest possible proof. He literally called it infirmissimus. But an argument that's based on divine revelation, now that is the strongest, most effective proof there is. Ethicissismus, as he put it. It's just a completely different league, a different standard of evidence altogether. So what's the bottom line here? The crucial point is this. Inside this whole theological system, the argument for celibacy isn't just, the opinion of a bunch of celibate guys. It's seen as resting on the ultimate authority, the authority of Christ and the apostles. And if you accept that premise, then the celibacy of the authors isn't a bias that disqualifies them. It's actually presented as the ultimate proof of their authentic witness. All right, next up, section 3, testing Thomas Aquinas. Because, let's be honest, this raises a really important question, right? What happens when one of these key authorities, like Aquinas himself, seems to have held some views that, from our modern perspective, are pretty problematic, especially when they're based on what we now know is just plain wrong science? Yeah, a common challenge you hear all the time is about Aquinas and his views on women. People point to that phrase, misbegotten male, and say, look, this guy was fundamentally wrong on something so basic. So the question becomes, if he was that wrong about something so important, how can we possibly trust him as an authority on anything else? So the defense of Aquinas hinges on making a really critical distinction. It goes like this. Theologically, he argued that men and women are absolutely equal in dignity. Why? Because they share the same rational soul, which is the very core of what makes us human. Now, his ideas about physical biology, Yeah, those were based on the completely flawed science of his day, stuff he got from Aristotle. So the argument is, okay, his science was wrong, for sure, but his core theological conclusion, which he drew from revelation, not science, was that women are fully and equally human, created by God. So really, the main takeaway from this whole defense is about separating two different kinds of knowledge. The core argument is that, look, making mistakes based on the temporary, provisional science of the 13th century doesn't cancel out the theological truths, because those truths are believed to come from a totally different source, a timeless, divine one. Which brings us to our final section, a system of belief. So how does this all fit together? Well, the final piece of the puzzle is to see this not as a bunch of separate ideas, but as one single, coherent, interlocking system. The idea here is that celibacy and marriage aren't competing with each other. Not at all. They're actually part of a balanced ecosystem. Think of it like this. Step 1. Families, through marriage, bear children. That's the source of everything. Then, step 2. Some of the people from those families are called to celibacy. Step 3. Those celibates then turn around and provide a spiritual witness back to the family, kind of pointing to the heavenly marriage that's to come. So you see, step 4, each one upholds the other. The whole system depends on this complementary balance. One can't really exist without the other. Okay, so let's just quickly recap the logic of the argument we've unpacked. First, the idea of bias is countered by framing celibacy as an authentic witness. Second, the whole thing is built on the authority of divine revelation, which is seen as the strongest possible foundation. Third, the theology is separated from the outdated science of the time. And finally, it's all tied together in this interlocking system, where marriage and celibacy are presented as totally supporting each other. And that really leaves us with a much bigger, more fundamental question, doesn't it? What we've seen here highlights a massive difference in how people even define truth. So think about this. When a worldview is built from the ground up on divine revelation as its ultimate source of authority, can arguments based on logic alone ever really challenge it on its own terms? That's a deep one to chew on.